Welcome to BusinessTraining.com, Requirements and Requirements Management. Welcome everyone. During this presentation, we will talk about requirements and requirements management. First, we will define what is a requirement. Then we will talk about requirement categories and requirement risk. We will also introduce a requirement management process, and finally, we will go through the characteristics of a good requirement. What is a requirement? It is a hugely important word for a business analyst. Requirements are necessary to specify when you deliver a product. In case of a software, it is needed to make sure that the end product or solution does what it is designed to deliver. According to CABA, the definition of a requirement is the following. A requirement is a condition or capability needed by a stakeholder to solve a problem or achieve an objective. It is important to mention that there is no defined or standardized format of a requirement. However, it is suggested that you use the same format within one project. There is no one best recipe for categorizing requirements. However, these are 4 categories that are commonly used by most organizations: business, functional, non-functional, and technical. Business requirements contain descriptions of business processes and activities, business rules, and information. Business requirements should also answer the question how the business communicates to its external environment. Business terminology is used in the description. As a business analyst, you must understand how the business operates and what are the procedures that they follow. Functional requirements show how the system operates from the end user's perspective. What are the software applications, the functions used, what steps the system should take in a specific situation. You will have a lot of opportunities as a business analyst to analyze and document functional requirements. Non-functional requirements are much more difficult to capture. These are requirements either the system or the environment should have. It is best if you try to quantify the requirement as much as possible. For example, the user should be able to enter in 5 seconds. Non-functional requirements can be classified into 5 categories: usability, reliability, performance, support, and security. Finally, there are technical requirements that include technical specification of a solution. Now we will move on to the requirements risks. There are a couple of risks that should be considered when managing requirements. First, you as a business analyst always have to consider the lack of user involvement. Many IT projects fail because users are not involved in the development process. If users are not considered in the testing, for example, the right functions will not be tested, and it will cause rework and thus more cost. Next, unrealistic customer expectations should be managed. You have to get it right for the first time. Do not try to postpone it. It will only get worse. Set the right expectations and establish some measurable criteria. You may also face some unnecessary functionalities as well. For the developers, there is a great temptation to try new technologies. You have to make sure that the users receive what they really need and no money is spent on unnecessary features. Ambiguous requirements also lead to increased costs, time, and rework. Make sure that requirements can be interpreted only one way. Finally, you have to be careful not to have conflicting or missing requirements. These can be well managed and discovered by using modeling tools such as business processes or activity diagrams. As a business analyst, your life will be about requirements and their management. You have to know and guide the team through the requirements management process. First, you have to plan, collect, and elicit requirements from the project stakeholders. Then you have to analyze requirements. Once the analysis is done, you have to present the requirements to the business users so that they can review the work. Finally, you have to manage the requirement specifications and validations and communicate the final set of requirements to the development team. There are 2 important things to remember about requirements. All requirements have to be written down and have to be presented to the business stakeholders. Remember, write and present. Now let's see the requirements management process in detail. As a first step in requirements planning, you have to define the roles and responsibilities. The aim of this exercise is to have a responsible person later assigned to each requirement. You also need to set up the schedule and communicate it to everybody who will be involved in the requirements management process. It is also required during the planning and elicitation phase to define what is the criteria to accept in requirements and what are the necessary standards for documentation. After planning, you have to plan the elicitation phase. The main purpose of elicitation is to discover both the functional and non-functional software requirements. You have to develop a plan that should include stakeholders to include method and timing. There is a separate training on elicitation, so I'll move on to the requirements analysis. The objective of requirements analysis is to obtain a finalized set of requirements that are documented and agreed upon by all stakeholders. You have to facilitate the process to solve conflicts and inconsistencies and to make sure that the requirements are presented in a standard and agreed upon way and that they reflect the stakeholders' needs. First, you need to discover and categorize risk. You can also see our separate training on that one as well. Then, you have to prioritize requirements if it has not been done at this point. It is important to understand the stakeholders' needs and see their priorities and agenda. Having analyzed risks and priorities, you have to start the requirements review process, which in the end will produce an agreed upon documented set of requirements. Now let's see how the requirements review process looks like. As part of the requirements analysis process, you have to manage the review of requirements. Although you can find a separate presentation on our page on review meeting, now I would like to quickly go through the review process itself. You start the process by issuing the starting or initial requirements document. You send it to the selected reviewers with a deadline to submit comments or change requests. Next, after incorporating all changes, you also need to update the reviewers on the result and finally issue the new requirements document version. The objective of the requirements specification and validation is to produce the SRS, which stands for Software Specification Document, and ensure all customer requirements are reflected. You also have to review all requirements and translate them into the developer's language and make sure that everything is documented. Now let's see what an SRS should contain and what are the characteristics of a good requirement. A typical SRS, or Software Specification Document, should contain the purpose of the document and the project, of course. It also has to contain all relayed documents and sources for the end-user requirements. Naturally, it should include the required business capabilities and functions and the proposed level of technology and capacity requirements. It also has to contain system and stakeholder constraints, and if needed, supporting data for any make or buy decision. You also have to review all requirements and translate them into the developer's language and make sure that everything is documented. Now let's see what an SRS should contain. Now to help you to prepare a concise requirements documentation, we will go through what are the characteristics of a good requirement. A requirement should be precise. There should be only one way to understand it. Otherwise, it will create confusion. It should also be complete. All known information should be included in the document. Keep it as a live document and update it throughout the course of the project. The requirements specification document should be consistent, meaning that there should not be conflicting requirements. It should also be possible to trace back the originator of the requirement and the improver as well. As requirement specification is the job of the business analyst and the business team, adding design information regarding the algorithm that will be used belongs to the developers, so leave it with them. Also, requirements should be prioritized. It is needed to be able to manage possible budget and time restrictions during the project. These kinds of things cannot be foreseen, and if you have your requirements prioritized, it is easier to manage such challenges. Requirements should also be verifiable. If it cannot be tested, it is not a valid requirement. Finally, let's go through with what we have talked about. We know that a requirement is a condition or capability needed by a stakeholder to solve a problem or achieve an objective. We differentiate business, functional, non-functional, and technical requirement categories. We also mention that every project has requirements risks, for example, lack of user involvement, unrealistic customer expectation, unnecessary functionality, or conflicting requirements. As a business analyst, you have to analyze and address the requirement risks. We also discuss the requirements management process that start with the planning and elicitation requirements. Then you move on to requirements analysis and review, and finally the specification and validation of the requirements. We also listed the characteristics of a good requirement. It should be precise, complete, including everything, and also be consistent with other parts of the project and requirements. Also, requirements should be traceable and should be prioritized. They should not contain design information. Lastly, requirements should be verifiable and testable. Thank you once again for your time and attention, and this is businesstraining.com, where you can earn a master's level qualification to make more money.